think I always thought it was a feminist issue, but I didn't realize it until I actually became a parent. I thought it was like from working on Head Start, I thought it was a racial issue in the United States and a poverty issue, but I never quite, it kind of dawned on me that that working was part of feminism, and women, if people are going to have children, somebody has to look after them well.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada, in small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. Martha Friendly, policy researcher, advocate, leading figure in the Canadian childcare movement. Born in New York City, Martha Friendly was a social science researcher following her post-secondary education and started working in early childhood education and childcare research in the late 1960s. She immigrated to Canada in 1971 and was part of the grassroots childcare movement growing in Toronto. In the early 1980s, Martha founded the Childcare Resource and Research Unit at the University of Toronto Centre for Urban and Community Studies. She is now its executive director. The centre is a policy research group campaigning for a universal childcare system. Martha is a published author of many reports, articles, and chapters, as well as books, and a regular public commentator on early childhood education and care, ECEC policy. She is the recipient of several awards, including an honorary doctorate from Trent University, part of the Women and Gender Equality's Women of Impact Gallery. Martha received the Order of Canada in 2024. Today we're talking to Martha Friendly. This episode is about her work in the childcare sector, the movement. Martha is a policy researcher with expertise in early childhood education and childcare and family policy. She is a leading figure in the movement, championing equitable, universal, high-quality childcare system. So, Martha, we're going to turn to some questions. And as in our previous interview, this is about your story and about your work and how you developed an interest in your life's work. And I want to know, what was your eureka moment? What really, motivated you to go into this particular field?
It actually was being a parent. So this was like the end of the 1960s, the early 1970s. I had been a graduate student in psychology, social psychology. There was too many other things going on. And it was actually after I immigrated to Canada with a 3-month-old. And I thought, oh, what am I going to do? How is this going to work? And actually, that really was what did it. So I immigrated to Canada with my husband, who taught at York, still teaches at York. And he came home one day, and I was sort of trying to figure out what I was going to do. I wasn't suited to being an at-home mother, but I hadn't known that, hadn't thought about it. And he said, York has a daycare center. It looks great. The kids are all running around naked. That was when and I thought, oh, that would be a thing to do. So my son went to York daycare when he was 13 months old. It was a parent co-op, and I got really involved in it. And I had been, in the anti-war movement, the women's movement, even before I immigrated to Canada. I didn't know anybody, and it helped me get kind of established and get to know people. And I realized how this fit into all women's lives, basically. And it was being a parent. I mean, I had experience with early childhood education project. I worked on one of the first Head Start project, research projects, but it had never applied to me. So I realized how this applied to me and how it applied to kids. And that kind of did it. I kind of never really looked back after that.
We don't often hear about that co-op movement for childcare at universities. And that's something that I think we need to hear more about, because it was a really kind of a unique thing at that time.
Absolutely. Do you know, we have a great paper written by one of my colleagues, Julie Mathian, who was a parent at the U of T. You know, they sat in for a year and all that. It's one of our CRU's papers. And it really, really does reflect. It reflects not only that co-op childcare movement at universities, but how it related to everything else. Was interesting because York was never as political as U of T was. I mean, I know that kind of in hindsight, it was kind of much more insular, making the co-op work. But it's sort of how I sort of got involved with people, the women at that time who were working on childcare.
But describe what the co-op is, because I would expect many of our viewers.
This was a university childcare center. It was kind of a hippie childcare center. This was actually just before they didn't have training requirements for staff in Ontario. That came a couple of years later. And it was licensed, and the parents had to participate in the program, which was great for my husband, actually, because he actually got to work in the toddler room. And I mean, I actually think it was fantastic for a lot of parents. It's funny that we know it's no longer really viable now, given times are really different. But that kind of, there was staff, but the parents actually had to work in the program and had to participate. And I do remember that actually writing a constitution for York Daycare kind of tore the whole thing practically apart. People were fighting with each other and all that type of thing. And we were there. We came just as the first director of the center came. So it was that type of childcare center. But it evolved. It evolved with everything else.
But also part of that evolution was things around funding and provincial funding. And there were some big issues that you still had to mobilize.
Well, we thought of it at the local level, because that was kind of the interface. But I'll tell you a little story about funding that really exemplifies this. So this first director came, and she kind of did a budget and all that type of thing. She had been a parent at the childcare and was an administrator at York. And she said, the staff, needs to have a wage raise. And then she did a budget. She said to the parents, so there needs to be a fee increase. And so the parents said, a fee increase? No. And they voted it down, because the staff's wages depended on the parent fees. So for me, I knew nothing about childcare funding or social policy at all. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting, because there was no funding except for fee subsidies for low-income families, which are not funding. They help pay for the fees. So she closed the childcare center. She said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to run a center without a budget. And she called in an auditor. I can still see him. And he explained to the parents that the staff's wages depend on the parent fees. So I still use that little story, because that's the way it was until the federal government stepped in a big way. And that's majorly important in why childcare never worked. And so for me, it was a great learning experience being a parent at York Daycare in that sense.
Yeah. And then there was other ways that parents would take care of their children. I mean, I took my children to a neighbor. I had 3 children. I never tended to my children if they were sick. My neighbor tended to them.
So one of the first jobs that I got was working at the Social Planning Council on one of the first studies of that kind of unregulated family childcare, because at that time, there wasn't such a thing as regulated family childcare. Now there is. So the women, some of the people who are your neighbor might be under regulation in every province or territory. So I worked on this study. I supervised all these interviewers who went out to providers' homes and interviewed them. And I still have the reports from it. So, I kind of exactly, I think what happened was my evolution in childcare policy kind of mirrored the evolution of childcare policy, because I do go back before all these things were in place.
Well, you would go back also to a time when most women were still at-home mothers, and women were then just getting into the workforce. So in the 60s, most mothers stayed at home.
Until the 80s, it was a majority stayed at home. I mean, I remember when it became a majority of mothers of young children were in the workforce. And also at that time, I mean, going back, I mean, just personally, my mother, who was always a feminist, when my son went to York daycare, she said, "What? He's so young. How can you do that?" And it took her a couple of years until she said to me, I realized that was the right thing to do for children also.
Yes.
I remember she said that to me, but she was quite taken aback. And I actually, it made me a fan of group childcare. Like, good. It wasn't, I mean, I wouldn't say now it was good, but it was special because it was a co-op. And I mean, I have to say that for years, my son kept some of the kids that he was a toddler at York daycare with as friends. In fact, some of my best colleagues and friends were parents at York daycare. We're still work together. It's still friends.
Yeah.
So that was not a normal experience. It was a special experience.
Yeah. And I had always thought that childcare is a feminist issue.
Well, let me think. I always thought it was a feminist issue, but I didn't realize it until I actually became a parent. I thought it was from working on Head Start, I thought it was a racial issue in the United States and a poverty issue, but I never quite, it kind of dawned on me that working was part of feminism, and women, if people are going to have children, somebody has to look after them well.
Yep.
And the other thing was because I was based in psychology, I sort of became the librarian to the kind of the incipient childcare movement, because even back then there was some research. The question was, is this good for children? And I read it. I mean, a background in psychology is a good research background.
I actually studied psychology. I studied law and psychology. How has the evidence changed, from the 1970s and 80s, and certainly now in parenting, and, the evidence must have really changed with the times as well. I mean, you're into research, so.
I mean, think about it this way. After I really, what the CRU really started as was, it's sort of my penchant to be a librarian and to collect up, to collect things up. And I remember when there was a small amount of stuff written about childcare. It was mostly psychology, developmental psychology, that type of thing. There wasn't, but let me think, you cannot keep track of it now. At some point, maybe even 10 years ago, we lost our ability to keep track of it because there's just so much research on different aspects of childcare that nobody had ever thought of. And there were things like, the history of there's all sorts of writing about the history of childcare. I mean, there are lots of political scientists writing about different elements of it, governance and all kinds of things. Like you could keep, it used to fill, when I was at U of T, I think probably even before CRU started, I worked on a research project to do with children at U of T, and CRU grew out of that. But my office was, it was a regular office, and they had shelves around the edges, and then probably most of the literature on childcare was in my office. It's nothing like that now. So there's a lot of interest in it from all different perspectives. And every once in a while, I find some new perspective, like, what did I come up with? I mean, like images of childcare in literature, for example. So somebody who's like HMS Pinafore, for example. You can call that childcare. Baby farming. She describes how she went to baby farming. There's all kinds of things. And what I find really fascinating is the intersections among them and who does what kind. Like I actually really am a researcher, even though I'm really part of the childcare movement. So I like to sort of see how these things fit in with people's ideas. So I think one thing that's completely changed is the question is not, is childcare good or bad for children? I think if somebody asks that question, I think, what? Like,
Wrong question.
it's the wrong question, because that isn't the question. The question is it good? What is it? Like,
Where is it? Who is it with? What are the...
yeah, well, those are all of the things that make it good. Is it responsive to the parents and all that sort of thing like that? I mean, in general, that is not the question anymore. The question is really, I mean, the way it's really changed is in some countries, many of the EU countries, it's there for children. I mean, yes, it allows mothers to go to work. I guess this would be the Danish description. Yes, it's important that women can work and men can work, but the primary purpose of the program is that it's for children. And we haven't gotten to that yet in Canada. I mean, it's not that people don't think that, but those things haven't come together yet.
But there's a lot of different styles in parenting. Through the ages, the evolution of parenting, how I raise my children and how my daughters are raising their children are completely different ways of raising children, but also in terms of different countries would have an emphasis in a different way. They're doing things in Scotland that I had never heard of. They're doing their outdoor education.
Oh, yeah.
The outdoor nursery. My granddaughter went to a nursery school outdoors in the woods.
Yeah, that's really like a Nordic and German tradition. And it's great. I mean, I've never actually visited one of these, but I mean, looking at films of them and talking to people about them, it's quite inspiring. And we haven't, I mean, it's not that there isn't anybody who's interested in that, and there are some, but they tend not to be regular licensed childcare. We're quite undeveloped not on the early childhood education aspects of childcare. We're still kind of stuck in, if you give a little bit of early childhood education, it makes the child's brain grow better. And it's kind of, it's not really where where people's thinking is about good early childhood education.
Well, my daughter actually not only takes her daughter, used to before she went to school, but she actually now goes there once or twice a month to actually help teach. And my daughter actually teaches young children all about gardening.
Oh, I love that's wonderful.
So her clients are nursery schools. So she'll go and conduct classes and she'll take them out to the gardens and it becomes things about numeracy and literacy and let's count the rocks and let's take a look.
Not overtly.
No. It's just play. Yeah. It's about play and let's do this and let's put a garden in a rubber boot. Yeah. So it's all about really being outdoors and learning about food, but it's not.
Yeah. My grandkids live in the Netherlands, which doesn't have a good childcare system, but I can see in their school, because they're in grade 5 now. I mean, but it really has had a lot more emphasis on conceptual learning, which would be, that type of thing. And it's not that we don't have any of this in Canada. It's just that people have been so occupied with basically hanging on by their fingernails.
Yes.
That they haven't. One of my friends who was one of the, he was one of the really good thinkers on ECEC in Europe, but internationally.
And ECEC is early childhood
education and care, which is kind of the international term. You can sort of see why it, would encompass both parts of it. And he worked for the OECD when they did a whole thematic multi-country review. And he said to me about Canada, he said, ECEC in Canada is a mile wide and a millimeter deep. And that's still true. I mean, so there's all sorts of people, and it's not that there isn't any good practice or any of that type of thing, but it hasn't really taken hold of it.
It's not consistent.
We're trying to build a system. We have a market. We're trying to build a system. And it's far from being mature.
Yeah. I wanted to go back a little bit. You came to Canada from the US in the 70s. So you probably still see and compare the social democracy between and policy issues as they've evolved or not between the countries. Like we may be not terribly sophisticated in some of our early childhood,
But
care.
it's not as terrible as the United States. I mean, well, don't get me started. I mean, the thing is, yes, it's true. I immigrated to Canada more than 50 years ago. So like 1971. It's kind of a joke in the family that I was born to be a Canadian. After a couple of years, we never looked back, and I never would. So the whole situation of childcare. Well, first of all, the country doesn't even have the concept of basic health care in the same way that we
Yes.
do. So, and I mean, it's kind of a joke that I knew nothing about social policy. And it's sort of, I always say it's because there really isn't social policy in the same way. Everything has become a market, a consumer item in the
That's
US
interesting.
in a different way. Well, it wasn't that way when we left. It's become quite different. When I look back at the roots of it, it is kind of a joke. We always say, well, we always learned that the American structure of government was the way. And now I realize, no, it wasn't. It does not, you can see it exactly right now.
Yes.
So that's what I mean.
It's actually exacerbated now. It's really more prominent, the way the media is, social media is, the kind of divisions, the state rights versus a federal, around the whole abortion issue is
and
bonkers.
People's expectations about the role of the state are, it's not everybody. My sister is quite political. And we have, good conversations, but our expectations are really different.
But in Canada, you also have, there's other issues in Canada. You've got the federal government who's not supposed to be in education.
Yeah.
You've got provincial governments who are responsible for education. So everything would be uneven across. So there's no kind of system because there are provincial, federal tensions. There's also municipal issues because, some of the licensing would be municipal issues.
Well, that's only an issue. Municipalities only have a role in Ontario in childcare, which I think is too bad. I'm actually doing some work on that. I think, and again, municipalities in Canada, and this is coming up a lot now, not particularly to do with childcare, they're creatures of the provinces. They don't exist constitutionally. You can
Yes.
see that. And, the United States, like Canada, is a federation, but Canada is a more decentralized federation. So the role of the state, it's contested in the United States, but not as much as in Canada. I know I've just written a book chapter on this with somebody else, the 5th edition of a main book on federalism. And it was quite fascinating to interview insiders about how we got the childcare program, but particularly with regard to the role of the federal government. It's quite obvious that this is a major barrier in Canada to doing a lot of things, actually.
Yeah.
It is a historical fact, but it is a major barrier as long as you have a good federal government that wants to move things ahead. And if you don't, well, then you're cooked everywhere and you don't. So, it's like it's what we learned. It's a check and balance. It doesn't always, to my mind, it certainly hasn't worked in childcare. It's one of the reasons we don't have a childcare system. It's one of the main reasons we don't have a childcare system.
Has the cabinet gender parity been at least for this particular government at least a little bit more beneficial? You would think, you have cabinet ministers that are having babies while they're in cabinet.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the questions, like what made this happen, and it's definitely true that the whole orientation. So it's the women in the cabinet, but also that there was a commitment to women's equality. So those things were related, but certainly the women in the Liberal cabinet the finance, they definitely had an important role in making this happen when it did.
So I want to go back to the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. I mean, they mentioned childcare.
Oh, yes.
And really,
more than mentioned.
There was a lot of stuff in the report on the Royal Commission. And, Monique Bégin was a good friend of mine. So, I mean,
Oh, yeah.
And she was the Secretary General of the Commission. Anyway, so there was a lot of things in the 1970s.
Yes.
About.
So that's kind of the start. We always start childcare advocacy from the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. And it is true that Monique Bégin did really get childcare. I mean, and what they recommended, if you look at it, isn't it? It never got put in place. And we always say it was, there were 167 major recommendations, and that was the only one that never really, even though there were attempts to put it in place, it never developed for a variety of political reasons. Actually, it just never got pushed over the edge that it has now.
I've been told Ken Dryden worked on. How did that sort of like evolve and die? Because there was that attempt.
I was really quite involved with that, and actually did work a lot with Ken Dryden on it. So it was basically Paul Martin became the prime minister. Things were kind of languishing. They were, they limped along. Paul Martin became the prime minister, and he became convinced that this was something to do, to put forward, and came up with this kind of plan, much smaller than the current plan, but definitely coherent. It had principles, and it had federal money, and Ken Dryden was the minister, and he wanted to do this. He was very interested in education. I mean, he wrote a book about high schools and all this type of thing like that, and quite smart and involved. And they really wanted to put a childcare program in place. It had been slightly preceded by an effort that Jane Stewart had made when she was the, whatever they called, ESDC at the time. It's had so many names, not health and welfare, but when she became the Minister for Childcare, she really tried to put money in a budget in place. And she was keen to put that in place. And, she kind of got sand kicked on that by the Chrétien government. So the Paul Martin program they went along, and it had less shape than the current program. There was not as many conditions, but they put a few conditions to the provinces. The provinces made agreements, bilateral agreements. They made bilateral agreements with all of them. They had the federal election that Harper got elected in, and it was the first thing that they did was cancel. There was a promise that they would address childcare by canceling these agreements, and they did. And they canceled everything that went along with them, including the organizations, the money that went through Status of Women, and other money, that went through what ESDC, whatever it was called at the time. And so people like me, I thought they'd last for 8 months, something like that. And they lasted for almost a decade. And it was the nadir. Basically, the childcare people like myself were enemies of the state. And there were all these, expressions, the best experts are mom and dad. We don't need experts.
That's right.
And all that type of thing. That was a bad period, but we did survive.
The work of the Child Resource and Research Unit has been essential and trailblazing in the space of childcare. When you founded the unit in 1980 compared to the present day, how's your mandate changed? It
actually hasn't. I mean, the thing is, I sort of look at it every once in a while, and I just wrote, I can't remember what it was. I said our mandate basically was always the same. I mean, basically, the kind of the markers of the childcare advocacy movement were laid down basically in the 1970s and 80s. The 80s was really the height, was when NAC was in its height. And that part of the women, that part of the women's movement was really flourishing. Childcare was really embedded in that. And so there was a national advocacy association that I've always worked closely with, and then a national sector organization. And we were kind of on the side, like running around saying, pay attention to this, pay attention to that. But I've always been.
So you've done all the research side and all of the.
Well, really, but I mean, I've always been an activist, like that way. And it was fine. I mean, so CRU was part of the Center for Urban and Community Studies at U of T. I was part of this earlier research project, and I started it in the urban center, and everybody thought it was good, it was fine, and it was, kind of the back, research, arm, and it was great until we only left that there when Harper cut all the funding, and so it needed, U of T wasn't going to. I wasn't a faculty member. I was a research associate, senior research associate. But it was, it was on outside money. So they always administered it like a research project. Basically, that's what it was. And then we, about a year after the Conservatives were elected, we lost all of our funding. And then there was a lot of ins and outs to the whole thing about what we were going to do with it. And I decided we didn't have money. They said to me, well, you're still a part of U of T. You can stay at U of T. I don't know what I would have done, but anyway, and, I had a couple of staff, and they put a lot of in-kind money into it. But I thought, well, I don't want to do that. So I made it into a nonprofit organization, incorporated it, and it was very, very tight on money. I mean, I have to say it was pretty thin if it hadn't been for the unions and a couple of foundations, actually, basically us doing projects with them and that sort of thing, that's what kind of kept it going. But it was very small. We moved into a space that we actually really enjoyed working in. And it was me and maybe one other person for a period of time. And it kind of kept it going. But, so I made money accrue to it in different ways by doing pieces of work and all kinds of things like that as a nonprofit organization. And
you mentioned the unions, because the unions would have been very involved in all of this. And women activists in the unions would have been.
Women activists in the unions, and that was always a feature of the childcare movement in Canada. I don't know if this is obvious, but Canada is somebody said this to me, a woman from the ILO said this to me at some international meeting. And she said, Canada is the only country that has a real childcare social movement. And there's always been a core of it, like with some childcare people that have been around for years in different forms, different capacities. The unions generally, and then all these social justice and feminist organizations have always been part of the childcare movement. And what's made it successful now, currently, is that that's all been kind of pulled back together, melded back together. It was very diffuse back there in the bad days.
But I would expect that they all came together because they knew that this current government wanted to talk about childcare. They would all.
Well, it was also that we decided, we collectively decided before that election to put childcare back on the agenda. And that was actually pulling together, a number of us pulled people together and said, let's figure out what our position is. Let's put childcare back on the agenda. I mean, it wasn't obvious that the Liberals would win or that they would have a childcare position, and they didn't at first. I mean, it was not. It was.
They were not expected to win.
It was. Yeah. It took a while till it really warmed up, and it certainly wasn't being enemies of the state. So, I mean, we had a big policy conference and sort of hashed through what the position. I think the strength of the childcare movement has been arriving at common positions, and so that would be a position that it has to be universal, not a targeted program for everybody. Even rich people could not be excluded, right? That it had to be publicly funded. We always danced around whether it should be free or affordable, but way back agreed affordable would not be preferable, but was okay. And it had to be high quality for children. The issue of the staff and their low paid role was always an issue for the childcare movement. Of course, the way I described, but that was always an issue. To change that, that's why you need public funding, because they're most of the budget, and it could not be a business. And that was an issue back in the 1970s, and it's still important.
Yeah. You do need to make it universal. You do need to make it affordable. And it's not a business. It's not this.
And especially from everything that we've seen in the last 20 odd years, we really, really now know why you really, really don't want to make it a business.
We've been having a really good conversation. We've been going back and forth a little bit. And I just wanted to take a look from a historical perspective. We are the Women's History Project. There is an evolution. And perhaps you can talk a little bit about that trajectory when you came in 70 and it just continued. And now we have, of course, the childcare.
So personally, the evolution. I mean, I didn't know anything about so many of the things that I now know about when I started. First of all, I never heard of social policy. I mean, just for starters. And I can remember when I learned that Canada had a Senate, actually. So that was some time in there. So the thing is that, and I think it's not just me, the people who are still standing, who were involved back then, it's kind of a bit of a joke about how little we know that taxation what's the role of taxation in this, and why a tax deduction is different from a tax credit, like many, many content things. But I think that the evolution it was kind of, at some point I realized I knew what I was talking about. I really didn't know what, I didn't even pretend to, I had an opinion about it, really. So there really was an evolution about, kind of being able to talk about some of these issues and sort of trying to explain them, and how does the government work, and what's the role of municipalities, and what's the role of provinces, and why is this better than that, and all that type of thing. Somewhere along the way, I even learned something about early childhood education, which is not my field, but I do know enough about it to know what makes a difference and what it looks like. And, I don't know what I would have thought back then if I went into a childcare center, some that you might go into today, where they have a lot of, they might have the frog curriculum that's supposed to be making the children smarter and all that type of thing. Would I have been skeptical of that back then as I am today, or more than skeptical? But I do have a much better idea about what that might look like, different parts of it. Over the years, I've learned about it.
Okay, so it started off as a passion, and there was a need. There was the union and mobilization among women and mothers and fathers to have a place for their children to go while they worked. And then increasingly more women worked. But then the policy, you're telling me that then you had to become a lot more sophisticated and talk about fiscal policy and taxation and jurisdictions and governance.
Things that we never.
So you started off with a passion. Children need to be taken care of, well taken care of, and they need to be safe. They need to be stimulated. And then you're now learning about how to take the movement from a passion to, let's put it on an agenda. Let's put it on the agenda.
Even that there wasn't, it wasn't that I had never had anything to do with politics, but it was the politics in the U.S. were different than they were in Canada when I came. But it was that kind of politics. It was basically the student politics, and, the anti-war movement took up a lot of time in the United States, the civil rights movement and that sort of thing. It was really different when I came to Canada, and I met all these people who were really seasoned. They had been in all these left-wing Marxist groups, serious ones and things like that. And so those were the people I got to know, and I thought, "Whoa, this is good," And seriously, and also, I never, even the role of political parties, it never occurred to me that until somebody came to my door in a provincial election, I don't know, after I was here for a couple of months, and said, "Oh, I'm from the New Democratic Party." I sort of knew what it was because I had read Penguin History of Canada before I came. But that it was actually operating was really different. It's a really different milieu than the United States, I have to say.
Yes, I think I was in the United States in 2016, and I didn't see very many signs on lawns during the election, that horrible election.
There's a real difference in the level of participation.
Yeah.
And even things like what you think your MP might do if you have a problem.
I'm very involved in politics. I'm really very engaged.
But it never
different
occurred
levels.
to me. It was quite different. People had political ideas. And also another thing is the United States is much more polarized.
Yes.
But I hadn't realized that, actually. I sort of knew it because of my family and everything. I mean, my family is fairly political, but I never really realized what it was like, and where our friends who were like in, American friends were in the, these fringe left-wing parties and things, where they fit in. But it wasn't a thing where it actually operated.
No.
So
no, we're all learning a lot more about the U.S. politics now. There's still much to be done for the women's equality, and particularly in the space of childcare. In your opinion, what is the current state of childcare policy in Canada? The $10 a day daycare and
I know it well.
Yeah. So good, bad. How do we sustain it? How do we grow it? How do we make sure that it doesn't get canceled?
Well, that's exactly the big issues now. But just to say, I never thought, well, two things. One is, we always thought that all we needed was the political, the childcare movement. I always thought that we needed the federal government to play a major role, partly because they have a lot of,
they have the money.
They have the money. And if it was going to become, across Canada, the federal government had to be involved in it. I never thought that it would be something that they would say, we're going to do this, and it would materialize. I spent a lot of time telling people that wasn't going to happen, that it would take a decade to put a childcare system, to build a childcare system. And the idea that what it should be was building a system was an idea from at least 25 years ago. That it wasn't just, it's certainly, and this is really, really clear from looking at other countries. It's really clear that if you do it purely on the end of parents and you reduce their fees by giving them a voucher or a benefit, or even just reducing their fees, that's not a childcare system. Those are the issues that England is having right now. The supply of childcare the market doesn't work for childcare. So either you get the wrong kind of childcare or you don't get it where you need it. That's one of the reasons it's so inequitable. This idea of childcare deserts. If it's not a planned program where somebody says, oh, well, we're building a new community over there in a subdivision or something, and they say, we need to put childcare there, just like we put sewers there. It might happen or it might not happen. That's why we're exactly in this situation now, is because I would say that in general, the childcare movement was influential enough to get these ideas across, that you can't just use the market. It's not about giving parents money, that it needed to be equitable, which means one of the things that's really ironic is that one of the groups that are left out of childcare are more marginalized groups.
Yes, of course.
It's ironic because the money going way back was always in the welfare system, but that didn't suffice to sort of make it work as a system. So these ideas, you can see them in the principles. Then you get into federalism, and how does the federal government make these things happen provincially? This is exactly the situation that we're in, because this is not a federal program. It's in provincial jurisdiction. The federal government, how far they can go. They went pretty far in saying to all the provinces, if you want the money, you have to reduce the fees by 50% in a year. That was pretty prescriptive. And basically, they all did that in different ways, more or less. I know because we collected data on it. They basically did that, and some of them went beyond that. That's not that hard to do. It's not that hard to do, because you take the parent money out of you say, okay, your fees are reduced to 50%. You use the federal money to fill that hole.
Yep.
Then you get to the question of expansion will primarily be through the public and not-for-profit sectors, which was a given, and that's the federal language. Well, how do you do that? So we sort of did a bunch of work on that and said, well, if you look at Denmark or the other countries, they took public responsibility for putting services there. Well, by saying we have a plan. There needs to be a child care center that has infants over there. Somebody has to do it. But here we've always waited for somebody to pop up and say, put their hand up and say, I'll do it.
As opposed to be very prescriptive and just take a look at a plan like you do a city plan.
It's part of planning in most countries. It needs to be part of land use planning. So that is in the works. And so the question is, this is my view, like, for example, a province could say, we're going to expand it by putting in every school, we're going to have childcare. So that happened in Ontario a long time ago, basically pretty much in the Peterson era that kind of started. There's a majority of the childcare in Ontario is located in school space. It's not run by the schools, but there is childcare. It's a way of growing childcare. And for years, until the Ford government came along, it had to be nonprofit if it was in a school. It was in that, but it's not anymore. So there's all these ins and outs to the whole thing about how do you do it and what do the different provinces want to do and how much are they, how cooperative they are and what they started with. So it's not easy.
Of course not.
And then you have the workforce issue, the childcare workforce, which has always been a problem, that the wages are low, the working conditions are not good. And then we had the pandemic, which decimated it.
But it decimated everything. It was.
People were really burned out because they did keep working, except for that one period when childcare was closed down, and then some of them still worked. And so there's a lot of burnout. It was always an issue, but it's a bigger issue. And then, of course, the federal money has mostly reduced parent fees. If you want to increase staff wages, which all the provinces they all increase wages, probably most of them have, but somewhat. So the question is it enough, and how did they do it? So then, the idea came along that we need wage grids that, in some of the provinces are putting them into place. So I guess what I'm saying is this is a work in progress, and it will be for a period of time if things keep moving ahead. Is there enough money? Well, probably not. But there's a lot of money. And then you run into problems like provinces that aren't spending the money even that they're getting. So there's a push-pull.
Oh, yeah.
There's lots of that type of thing. So I guess that's the current state of it. If you look around, there's been some big successes and a lot of smaller successes, and then a lot of problems and issues. So I guess this is, because I've worked internationally and all this type of thing, all countries have this kind of problem. It's harder in a federation. It's probably harder post-pandemic. I think that in a way it was what made it happen. I mean, it was a major thing that pushed it over the edge, really. But it's also, everything is very disorganized, there's a lot more chaos, and everybody, lots of workforces are having a lot of issues. So I think it's a very difficult time. And I guess then the thing is, if we had a clear sailing and we didn't have a looming federal election, and it was back 2 administrations, liberal administrations ago,
it would have been a little bit better embedded.
It would have been better. I mean, certainly it would have been better. So here's the big question. I mean, maybe this is what is it strong enough to be sustained if the government changes, federal government changes? The legislation, there is now legislation, but it's not. What we would envision there would be changes that would really undermine it.
Yeah.
I don't think that.
Yeah, it's not embedded. It's not a system yet.
It's not a system
yet. It's not like schools.
And in any country, even if you look at Sweden, where there's very good descriptions of how they built the childcare system, but when they've elected from their more right wing, not as right wing as our conservatives, but more right wing, then childcare, they don't do away with it because it's too entrenched, but they've changed it. And then, governments, it's never linear.
Yeah. I get it.
Yeah.
We're going to just wrap up in a minute. What would you have done differently if you had to do it all over again?
I think first of all, I really like what I do. I still really like working on it. And I think it's actually still continues to make a difference. I would have strengthened it a lot earlier because I sort of did assume that things would go along as they did. And then they didn't. So I would have strengthened that.
The pace.
Yeah. I think I would have strengthened it a lot earlier. I'm not sure how, but I mean, I probably would have thought about it more because it's not very sustainable as it is. It's not sustainable.
Yeah.
I think it plays when I look back, there's a lot of things that existed, and you probably would, if you think about this, you see the same structures and institutions that existed 20 years ago that were progressive and could play a role in progressive public policy and things like that aren't there anymore.
Yeah.
And
I would assume, though, something like, in Ontario, the full day kindergarten was helpful and started to address some of the issues.
Well, it does. So it was very destabilized. So this is a big problem about early childhood education and the form of kindergarten and childcare in Canada. So it was very destabilizing to childcare, and it was very destabilizing at the time. And at the time, I thought it was badly done. And there were things that I still don't agree with about the way it's done from the point of view of early childhood education. But one of the things that has actually, it really makes a difference in parents' use of childcare is the growth of full-day kindergarten. So it's not only Ontario, but now all the kindergarten for 5-year-olds, except in 3 provinces, is full school day.
Right.
So that makes a difference. And then there's growing 4-year-old kindergarten.
Yes.
So if all the provinces had full-day kindergarten and it fixed the things that I think should be fixed about it, but that's just a detail, and they were in place, it would change the dynamics about how because parents are not seeking full-day childcare in Ontario if they have a 4-year-old, because they all go to kindergarten. They're still looking for childcare around the edges, but not quite as much. And I think that you can look at the Stats Can data, which we're actually just looking at, and you can see that it really changes the pattern. And so that it's a really interesting question about if all the provinces did that and took responsibility for it, right? Because the federal government...
that's one part of the problem solved, but you still have all the other times that you need childcare and early childhood educators on the fringes of it.
Well, so that's the question: is what does kindergarten look like in terms of how many kids are in it, who the teachers are, what the day is like? I mean, if I can give you just an example, when my grandkids were 4, so they're born in January, twins, and it was time for them to go to, they were in daycare, and they would go to kindergarten the next year. So my daughter said, "Oh, thank God their birthday's in January. They don't have to go to kindergarten because they'd never survive it because they don't get to take a nap." And nobody really they don't really sit down and have, she said, all my friends are complaining about it, because they were all that same age. So it's exactly what it is. And does it work for children? So then the question is, it's got put in place and this is what I think should happen. Somebody should have assessed it and said, are there changes we should make? So there are some things that were really good about the way it was done in Ontario and some things not. But definitely it plays an important role. I think it's one of the I think it's really silly that there are 2 different programs under 2 different departments for kids of the same age. Like a 4-year-old is in kindergarten. This is true in other countries too, and they might have wraparound after school.
Mm-hmm.
You could fix that, somewhat. Like I think the things that still need attention to be fixed, I'll tell you the three things that I really think are not getting attention. What happens in the interface between kindergarten and childcare? What about parental leave? Because there's a lot of issues in that. And how does school, after school childcare, going up from 4-year-olds up to 12-year-olds, basically, how does that work? Who runs it? And,
Yes.
like those things.
Yeah.
Those are still structural issues that, as I say, going forward, I always thought I still think would have to be addressed. Parental leave is one that really needs to be made better, for sure. And they're not separate.
No. I understand. But it's like, it's a child's continuation. It's their evolution.
Yeah.
And how are we
And families.
providing for them and families? And yeah, I understand that
it's really interesting. Like
it's like a patchwork.
It's still a patchwork.
It's still a patchwork up until the time that they're almost going to high school.
Yeah. And Canada's not unique in this, but it could be done a lot better. It could actually be done a lot better. I mean, the interface, the alignment between childcare and parental leave is quite poor. Like, one of the reasons that parental leave has been extended to later, this is quite an interesting feminist question, is if you extend parental leave because you don't have infant childcare, which is part of it, then is that good for women? Because it's mostly women. And then what do you do about that? Because it still is mostly women who take it.
Yes.
Right. So
yes.
The things are all open questions, but at least we have parental leave. Lots of people, there's lots of people who aren't eligible for it. The same people who don't get childcare. It's not universal.
It's not. It depends on your job. It depends on where you're working.
If you work in the federal public service and it's topped up, it's good. Actually, Quebec's parental leave, if the rest of Canada adopted Quebec's parental leave, not the childcare system, but the parental leave, that would be a big advance, because in practically every domain, parental leave is better in Quebec.
Interesting.
I'll show you. I have a chart on this. It is actually interesting, and it wouldn't be that hard to fix up parental leave. One thing is contributory.
Wow, that's it. When I had babies, we had 17 weeks.
Yeah,
and we had to go on unemployment insurance. 17 weeks. I went back to work after 10.
When Abigail was born, so she's 42 or something like that. Parental leave hadn't been. We didn't have parental leave. It was just maternity leave.
Maternity leave.
That's what I mean. It was
That's
just
right. Maternity leave, 17 weeks.
And it was paid, and it's still paid at a low level. In fact, the level was reduced. I don't know, going back. But parental leave could be made a lot. Like I really think parental leave is part of childcare.
Yeah.
I think this is a really big difference to the United States. There is no parental leave.
I know that. My daughter lives in the United States. Yeah.
And so is that a good thing? Well, I don't know.
No.
But people don't seem to want to put a 2-month-old or less baby in. And it's also, then you get into the situation of the childcare has to be really, like, if you have 2-month-old babies in childcare, somebody has to hold them, it's sort of like, it's not one-on-one, but it's practically. So I think 1 year seems to be a good.
I had a nanny for 18 months.
Yeah. Like, people do different kinds of.
And then I went up.
Anyway.
I'm going to ask the last, and lastly, I'd like to just close with this. What kind of advice would you give young women who are leading a movement such as this, or joining your movement? What would you tell them? Give them some advice. Tell them to do what?
Don't give up. And also, it's good to really know about things and make sure that you're working. People, it only works if it's this is not a field for prima donnas or stars. It's like it's a social movement. And I mean, doing things collectively and sort of working things out that way, I think that's really what's paid off for childcare. I really mean that. I also think knowing things
Also,
they
knowing
said.
the history.
And I was just about to say that knowing the history is really, really important. So just for information, childcare now has its own real historian, a young woman at Queen's whose field is the history of childcare.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's a great advance that we're important. That it's now. When I first met her, I thought, well, now we're serious, like enough to be studied by different people. And I mean, so she's like great. She's tenured young faculty member and all that sort of thing. What I mean is the history is really important. I think the history of the childcare movement is really interesting. And some of us keep saying we really we need to write a book about it, like sort of kind of what you're trying to do, but, like something longer. But unfortunately, there's a lot of things that need doing that take up a lot of time.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. There we go. It's about the history.
Yeah.
It's about the history. We're going to end there. Thank you very much, Martha, for joining me.
Thank you very much
Thank
for doing it. Thank you.
I'm Debra Davis, President and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production, with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guests. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.